Welcome everyone to the August edition of SEAL Conversations. My name is Marcus Wagner. I'm one of the two executive vice presidents for the Society of International Economic Law. And before I hand over to our moderator for the evening, Lisa Toohey, let me briefly make a few announcements. Number one, as you know, we will be recording the session as we did the last time around. And we know the time isn't ideal for everyone, so we will make the video available on the YouTube channel. That said, the YouTube channel now has the first SEAL conversation available, and we'll post additional videos in the future. The best way to find it is probably just search on YouTube Society for International Economic Law. Number three, we've scheduled our next event already, and it's approaching reasonably quickly, namely on September 10th, with a roundtable on African Continental Free Trade Area agreement in an era of waning multilateralism, of optimists and skeptics. And the event will feature Olabisi Akinkugbe, Ohio Umionu, Vela Kidviru, Regis Simo, and is moderated by Melaku Desta. We very much look forward to this event, and we hope that you will participate there as well. Lastly, if you have any ideas for future SEAL conversations, please don't hesitate to be in touch. You can look my email address up on the website of the University of Wollongong, find me on Twitter, any way that works. Now, without any further ado, Lisa Toohey.
Thank you, Marcus. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, wherever you are. Welcome to the second SEAL conversation, which we've designed to coincide in the Northern Hemisphere, at least, with the new academic year and people returning to teaching in a very, very different world. So our topic, therefore, is international economic law in a changing world, new approaches to teaching tomorrow's knowledge and skills. So for those of you who haven't met me before, I'm Lisa Toohey. I'm a professor of law at the University of Newcastle in Australia, and long-time SEAL member and former member of the SEAL Executive Council. So tonight, the format is very much the same as the last SEAL conversation. You have a question panel where you can ask questions, and we will try and answer some of those as we go, and we may reserve some of those questions for the end. Also, during the course of the seminar tonight, we'll have a number of polls which will pop up and allow you to participate in the seminar in a little bit of an interactive fashion. So thank you everyone for being here. I'll start by giving each of our panelists just a couple of minutes to introduce themselves. We're very, very grateful to have you all joining us today for this session, particularly what's a very busy time of year for many of you. So Yogesh, could I start with you for an introduction?
Yeah, thanks Lisa, and also Marcus for getting this organized. It's wonderful to be with all of you. I have been in this teaching business for some time now. It's 10 years. I have taught at a couple of law schools in India, and before that I was working with the South Center as a consultant in Geneva. And my early exposure to international intellectual property and international economic law was through my master's, which I specialized in intellectual property. And I taught in Jodhpur, NLU, National Law University in Jodhpur in northern part of India, northern western India, for 5 years. And there we had a lot of subjects, on trade law. We have a trade law honors. And that's where I began teaching some of the subjects like dispute settlement and, international IP. I have been with the National Law University in Delhi currently for the last 4 to 5 years. And I teach international IP as one of the core subjects in IEL, and I also do a survey paper on intellectual property and other specialized paper like IP and competition law and other papers, that we have here. Thank you.
Thank you. And then I'll hand over to Emily.
Okay, thank you, Lisa, and good afternoon here from Southampton. Early afternoon, but it has made it to afternoon. First off, I'd like to thank Lisa and Marcus for inviting me to be part of this discussion, which I think is going to be a very interesting conversation. This is a tricky time for teaching in any context, never mind teaching international economic law, which has challenges of the discipline to add to the current challenges facing us as a global community. I'm Professor of International Economic Law and Sustainable Development at the University of Southampton here in the UK. And I've been researching and writing on European Union and international trade law for over 20 years now, which takes me by surprise, sometimes I have to say. Mostly, I've been working at the University of Southampton, although I've also spent part of my career at the Universities of Sussex and earlier at Durham. I was the Associate Dean for Education and Student Experience for a number of years in the Faculty of Business, Law and Art at the University of Southampton, but I am now fully and probably quite happily back in the law school and no longer Associate Dean. But over the 20 years of my career, I've taught WTO law, EU trade law, aspects of EU external trade in particular relations, and regional economic integration. But most recently, I've developed a module in globalization and law, which looks at law's responses and potential to address the current contemporary challenges facing us as people, I guess. And that ties together aspects of public international law, WTO law, regional economic integration to address particular global challenges such as sustainable development and climate change. And that really reflects my research interests, which are in the tension, interaction, and interrelationship between economic interests, economic liberalization, and the protection of non-economic interests such as environmental, human rights related, so those that are tied together in the concept of sustainable development.
Thank you. And Toma?
Hi everyone. Happy to be here, so to speak, and thank you for organizing, Lisa, Marcus, everyone at SIEL. Yes, I think it's a good opportunity to try and think about the puzzles that everyone in legal education or in academic education in general is confused and thinking about, and maybe think about how things are more, what's special about international economic law, certainly in these troubled times. I am a professor at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. I teach both at the law faculty and at the Department of International Relations. So one of the topics, at least, that was also raised in a preliminary discussion was teaching non-lawyers. So I have some experience with that, and yeah, you know, we're all in the same boat, I think. So happy to jump in.
Thank you. And Thomas?
Thanks, Lisa. So I'm Thomas Molloy. I'm here in Sydney in Australia. And I work for an education consultancy company based in Melbourne, and I run the Sydney office. So we go into universities at the moment around Australia and also in the UK, actually. And we've been helping these universities to deal with the COVID crisis, but before that also building their courses and bringing their face-to-face courses into blended courses or fully online courses, and we're working in the area of full courses. We're really moving into the area of micro-credentials at the moment, which is becoming a little bit of a hot topic here in Australia and around the world, particularly in the United States, I think. I used to work with Lisa for 7 years at the UNSW Law School as the instructional designer there to bring their programs into the online as well. So I've been pretty much in education all my life. In fact, I've been in education since I was probably 5 years old, because I never really, I just went all the way through my life in education. Before that, I was in Japan. I was working in the international baccalaureate system in Japan for a while. So I'm the non-academic education person on the panel.
Thank you, and we're very glad to have all of you here. And I think right at the outset, what's front of mind for all of us is just how rapidly things have changed, just even since the beginning of this year. Trends that started in online teaching and so on have rapidly accelerated for most of us, and we're teaching international economic law in such an unusual time and space. and that brings up its own challenges as well. So we've got a series of questions, but we'll also be very happy to sort of jump in and go with audience questions as well. But in our conversations that we had in the lead up to this conversation, I think one of the interesting questions that came up was this idea of who are we teaching? Who do we actually have in our classrooms? And also, obviously we're teaching people who are students, but what is our goal in imparting knowledge to those students or transforming the way they think? Are we thinking about equipping our students to become government officials, or perhaps lawyers in private practice, or something else? And how might those goals differ between us, and how does it influence how we teach? So perhaps, Yogesh, I can start with you. Who do you see yourself as teaching in your classes?
So thanks, Lisa. So I think this issue on who are we teaching boils down to actually both the demand side and the supply side issues that we have with reference to the international economic law community as such. So, for example, if I try and recollect where the students have ultimately gone after law school, most of them have gone into international firms that do IEL kind of niche litigation. In India, we don't have that kind of situation. So some students whom I know, who were interested in IEL and who took up IEL careers, they ended up going to these law firms abroad. But a large majority from who started practice in India and who decided to stay back and look into IEL issues, they have ended up doing trade remedies, largely anti-dumping and customs valuation and all those kind of issues, those kind of cases. Now, what's the problem here? The problem is that in an international economic law class, if you say, or even if you want to do trade law more specifically, one of the problems that we encounter is doing trade remedies is highly practice oriented, in the sense the questions are very factual. You have to end up doing a little bit of calculation. You have to know a little bit of accounting and very factual stuff, rather than a lot of law, because there is some kind of litigation around trade remedies, domestic litigation, but most of it is it requires sort of years of practice to get that kind of outcome. Having said that, from what I have heard from the feedback from law firms in India is that the teaching of IEL, from the case method that we use usually in terms of looking into the various agreements and then the disputes and trying to do a kind of analytical kind of teaching, the case method is limited in the sense that it is largely theoretical, and that seems to be one of the major issues that we have seen in terms of whom we are trying to teach. The problem seems to be that there are different kinds of interests, because some are really interested in, for example, joining public service. But for example, in India, public service is not specialized; it is generalized. So even if you, because of the common entrance of the Union Public Service Commission, even if you have interest in trade and if you get into some kind of civil service, you would do non-trade kind of work. So getting into trade does not require you to have a trade background. And from what I have seen, many trade specialists who have put in years of experience, 15 years or 20 years, they have done it on the job. So it's on the job training rather than the training that was imparted in either a law school or some other university. So there seems to be that kind of a mismatch. The third point is the problem with Indian IEL landscape with reference to the opportunities for students who have to be trained in a law school is that India's litigation at the WTO or other international economic law forums is quite limited. So on an average, I can say that we have 1 or 2 cases every 2 years and not more than that. And if that is the situation we are into, the practice is quite niche. And if you have the government of India, because largely it is public law, except investor state dispute, since it is public law, the government is involved in litigation, and the government wants to see that many law firms have a chance to sort of do the same thing in terms of capacity building. The government has its own ideas towards capacity building, but that is not working, because since the area is niche, you can't have 20 different law firms trying to grab a piece of litigation every 2 years or every year or so. So we need few firms, but those that are specialized. So in my view, what I think should be done about the situation is to have a little bit of more interaction between the industry and the academia, especially the legal fraternity, to find out what kind of expectations are warranted from a law school. And I think that's where we are in India in terms of IEL teaching. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Toma, what about you? Is your context somewhat different to that?
Yes, I think it might be, and I think it might be useful to draw a distinction between training and teaching. And this also relates to specialization, because it is a niche. There's no way of not thinking about this as a niche area in terms of the law, even if it has society-wide and huge political implications. And I think that that's one of the things that is interesting about teaching rather than training. And I will teach everyone, and at least my experience also in the last, maybe not 20, but close to that, is teaching non-lawyers and economists and people from the political sciences and also lawyers about this field as a field that isn't necessarily just a legal field. Law is just one part of the puzzle. And I think, at least my experience has been that it's a good platform for teaching non-lawyers about how lawyers think. And I actually for many years, I've had a slide in a PowerPoint presentation in any course related to international economic law. Why don't you need to study this area? Because the chances that you will actually be engaged, and Yogesh referred to trade remedies, that I'm just it's a calculated risk, but I'd say that 50+% of the practice in this area in the trade bar is trade remedies. Yeah. It's something that technically is so specialized, and I don't teach it. I really don't teach trade remedies. If you want, especially if you want to work in trade remedies, so, go into antitrust, go into trade remedies. But that's just about who we teach and the difference, I think, between training. I would like, as a vision, to know that, to hope that people working in other areas of international law and also domestic law, that they at least have some kind of peripheral vision of this area of international economic law, so that they can identify that there is an issue there and that there is a problem there, and they're, it's part of the toolbox, even if they're not used to using those tools.
Thank you. And Emily?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. I feel like we're moving along a spectrum from starting with Yogesh's very applied approach to teaching international economic law. I think when I'm teaching, and this possibly reflects the mix of undergraduate and postgraduate students that I teach, possibly to some extent, I'm not sure, but I see it first and foremost that the people in front of me are people, they're humans that I'm teaching. And I think this maybe sounds possibly a little bit kind of cringily idealistic, but I want my students to develop the questioning and the critical thinking skills that they might apply in any area of law, but the kind of questioning and critical thinking skills, the communication skills, and the reflective processes to equip my students to be good citizens, and therefore to be able to make a positive contribution both to life and to their chosen profession, whether their profession is in legal practice or whether it's in government or journalism or commerce, trade, wherever it is. Essentially, I think I see students first and foremost as people, and therefore, does it affect how I teach? Yes. I think clearly it does, and it's probably contributed to the extent to which I focus on inclusion of theoretical framework. The purpose, the underpinnings of the rules that I'm teaching them, and clearly, this is not a means of avoiding teaching the rules. The rules are kind of central, core to what we teach as lawyers. But I actually think encouraging the students to think about the purpose of the rules and question the purpose of the rules, question the purpose of the legal regimes that I'm focusing on in the classroom, and to recognize the contestability of the objectives of those rules, and also to recognize the implications of that contestability in terms of, therefore, the interpretation and the application of the rules, because recognition of that contingency, really, and that contestability of the rules equips the students, whatever way of life or profession of life they go into, but in particular, if they are going into practice, it equips them with the skills to really address new problems and new issues as they emerge, and new cases. So I think that, yes, it does affect the way in which I teach, and clearly that does, that's about my, I suppose some people would say, my agenda in my teaching, but that focus on the kind of bigger picture. Law doesn't sit in isolation, and lawyers don't sit in isolation. Law is part of society, and lawyers are part of society, and students are part of society, and they move, and we all move. So yeah, but it's quite a different take.
Yeah, absolutely. I think from my own experiences, one of the things that I found both interesting and useful in a classroom, but also challenging, was having that mix of students. So certainly when I was teaching at UNSW, we would have a very large group of very mixed classrooms. So a lot of law students, but also quite a number who weren't studying law. So they didn't have any legal training. They may only have been taking trade law as a postgraduate course. And then also students came from a huge range of countries. So it was like a mini United Nations in the classroom. And all of those things, I think, while they presented their own challenges, also added a lot to the sort of the insights that we had in the room, which also brings me to one of the early questions that we've had on the Q&A from Professor Islam from North South University. And he was wondering if anyone had any insights to share about teaching international economic law to students with no background in international law. So coming fresh to international law, or perhaps not even any legal background per se. And I think that idea of knowing what we're doing in the classroom and why we're there and what our goals are can really help to deliver that content to a diverse student cohort. But throw over to all of you for any other insights there.
I can go ahead, Emily.
Okay, thank you, Tomer. I mean, I would say that I assume when my students are in a classroom signed up for an international trade course, I don't assume any prior knowledge in public international law, but I absolutely would spend an early seminar or 2 seminars covering the fundamentals of public international law, because I think unless we understand where international trade law, international economic law sits within that wider field of public international law, it's really very difficult for the students to understand it. So I don't assume any prior knowledge of public international law, and I recognize that that's quite different to where we have non-law students with a non-law background are another degree of challenge, because while we might not assume any knowledge of public international law and cover that, you do have to adjust what you're doing in terms of delivery to non-law students, because there are a lot of things that we take almost for granted as people with a background training in law that we have to unlearn in order to recognize where we have to teach those who are new to the discipline. And it's a challenge. It's not impossible, but it is a challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other big challenges we have with teaching a subject like international economic law is just the sheer breadth. I mean, there are just so many topics that we can choose within that. And then, of course, yeah, there's more theoretical or more practical approaches. And as educators, we have to make a huge number of choices when we put together a course. So my second question then is, how do you strike a balance between having that breadth and having that depth? So perhaps I could throw to Tomer to kick this one off.
So yeah, so I'll follow up first of all on the non-lawyer issue, which I think is important also for lawyers, and this also relates to depth and breadth. So what about indeterminacy of law? Okay, this is something that I have. It's always struck me that non-lawyers think that non-lawyers tend to be more positivist right? That they think that the law is something determinate and that we lawyers have the answers, whereas the lawyers, in other words, legal students in 1L, 2L, first year, second year, then they have a better understanding of the indeterminacy of law. So just the indeterminacy, which is such a hugely important issue, certainly in international economic law, even in trade remedies, right? Zeroing, right? Reasonable people can disagree on so many issues. That in itself, I think, is something that is important to teach as a concept for non-lawyers. And that also relates to depth and breadth. And here, my clear preference is for, well, it's for depth. I think there's very little to be achieved in breadth. Also in practice, there are people working in government who can be working for 3 years on the same argument in a single WTO panel complaint, and they have very little vision about the bigger picture. Certainly not from a legal perspective. It's important, but we don't need to, I don't think that we need to teach that. It's dealing with the particular issues. It's a broad skill that lawyers need to have, not necessarily just in international economic law.
And Yogesh, what about you? How do you manage that balance?
Yeah, I will definitely answer on the breadth and the depth question, but just to follow up on a little bit on the non-lawyer teaching issue. I agree. I tend to agree with Umar, who he has mentioned that lawyers, actually law students, tend to think in non-positivist terms rather than non-lawyers trying to think in terms of positivist terms, because law they think is fixed. I think that observation is very, very precise, because I have seen this in our classrooms, and that's why, at least in a law school environment, I think it's important that for those who want to get into hardcore litigation and practice, it's important they do international law as a background paper, and at least 5 major issues in international law. That is sources, relationship between municipal law and domestic law, Vienna Convention, interpretation of treaties, then you have state responsibility and dispute settlement. I think these are the 5 key areas that every law student who wants to do international economic law has to kind of pretty much understand, because there are several normative aspects. The problem with not having that kind of background is that trade law, international economic law, particularly IP law, international IP law, is muddled in a lot of geopolitics. And we don't want to end up, in every class, having to see, this kind of normative questions and the basis of the law being raised, rather than looking really into the, precise and clear-cut law. I mean, that's the way in which, different teachers are oriented to teach. But answering, to you on the question of breadth and depth, definitely, I don't think, there is any law school in India where international economic law is taught as a single subject. I'm not sure. Because we have separate papers designed for international IP, we have papers for dispute settlement, WTO dispute settlement, and then we also have papers for dispute settlement in international economic law, where you include investment law and other forums, and then you have trade as specialization in itself. So I don't know that there is a single paper that you can have for international economic law as a survey course. It's too wide. Then that it definitely means that we would be focusing a little bit on depth. But having said that, I think a broader understanding of the overall working of the multilateral, plurilateral, and the bilateral system, or the regional trade agreements, I think that broad understanding of what is happening in the background is important. So I would open up the classes with these broad kind of general topics on the trading system, and then move on to very precisely. For example, if I'm teaching the TRIPS agreement and international IP, then I would move on specifically to those issues. That's how I do it.
Thank you. And Emily, you mentioned sort of that balance between theory and practice. How do you sort of manage that, and how much time do you spend on core principles versus what you might sometimes call the trade and type issues?
I mean, I think this is a really interesting question, and I think that if I'm teaching a trade law course, then the first thing I would do is put that trade law course into the context of the wider public international laws I've just said, in order to be able to locate it and contextualize it. But then clearly my focus for the balance of the course, or a significant part of the balance of the course, would be on the fundamental rules. Because again, if the course is about trade law, trade rules, then there is no escaping, and you wouldn't want to avoid the need for a degree of rigor in the coverage of the fundamental rules, the key principles, what makes the WTO law, for instance, distinct, what are its key features, etc. So that kind of rigorous engagement with what the core rules are is really fundamentally important. But then that I would absolutely underpin with this question about what are the purpose of the rules. And, you know, for instance, if you look in the EU context, you might say, well, is the EU liberalisation? And you can ask this question also about WTO, maybe less obviously, but is the EU designed in terms of economic liberalisation to secure an unfettered right of access to the market? Or are the liberalisation rules intended to secure the removal of discriminatory barriers? And that debate has been played out in the EU context, and it runs through some of the case law, and it's, you know, it's interesting, but it has significant ramifications in terms of then what states are able to do in terms of national regulation. And you can look at that also in the WTO context. So sure, we look at the national treatment rule, you would absolutely have to cover that, look at its application in the case law. But then that question about why is this rule? What is the objective here? Is it a framework of non-discrimination, for instance? Or is there something more going on underneath it? Is it intended to go further? What are the ramifications of that? And putting that into kind of theoretical framework context, looking at what the purpose is crucial to my mind for understanding what the law's purpose is. Yes, but also it's crucial to understand the contestabilities I've said earlier of the interpretation of purpose of the regimes in order to ensure that a legal regime which is located within a particular social context or developed in a particular social context, in order to ensure that that legal regime can evolve and can adapt, and that those using the rules within that regime are able to look at the room for interpretation and challenge traditional accepted interpretative approaches where appropriate in order to allow the law and the rules to better reflect contemporary society. So you can see that really clearly with regard to trade and environment. The fact that there was no environmental reference within the GATT, for instance, and which reflected the time of the negotiation of the GATT. Conservation of natural resources was about mineral resources, you know, that's a given. And yet here we are in a society, in a context in which environment and the need for environmental protection is almost universally recognized. Not quite fully recognized. Don't mention Tony Abbott right now in the UK, but almost universally recognized. And therefore the trade rules with no reference to environment, we have to think, well, how do we ensure that those trade rules don't squeeze out any potential for protection of the environment? And the appellate body has done that by adopting an evolutionary approach and looking at the wider context of public international law. So it all comes round in circles, and we have to locate law and the rules that I would spend a lot of time looking at, but locate it in that wider context in order law to be able to serve the society in which it operates.
One of the things I always admire when I hear you talk, Emily, is the way that you can move between the very high level of abstraction and these big picture concepts and then right down to sort of the nitty-gritty of the case law. I'd like to throw over to Thomas, because that idea of moving between the big picture and the sort of the detail is always a really difficult decision for teachers to make when they're trying to design a class. And, you know, you have a lot of potential content and you can see on the poll results, you know, the huge amount that can potentially be included in just a single course that might be, you know, 24 or 36 hours. What would be some of your sort of advice as a learning designer for people who are trying to make that decision of how much breadth of topic versus how much depth?
Yeah, well, it sounds like in this field there is a lot of content, a huge amount of content. So I think, Emily, you're very right there to go down the path of kind of conceptual frameworks where you're hanging a lot of that content on the concepts, the core concepts and the core rules. And my advice would be really that, you know, get the students then to go expand out from those core concepts. So you are the kind of pillar in the middle, and then the students are going out and bringing in the information that you might need them to learn for that particular topic. they all bring it into the key concepts. So the key concepts are the things that you need them to get out of the course, and then a lot of the content then becomes incidental in some ways to those core concepts. And I think a lot of the learning then will come through you know, those students really getting a clear idea of what those concepts are.
Another really nice way, I guess, of making important concepts a lot more clear and practical for students is to sort of broaden their interaction with the world of international economic law through what we sometimes call experiential learning. So bringing real world situations into the classroom as far as possible, or taking students out into the real world. And I'm wondering if anyone on the panel wanted to talk about sort of experiential learning aspects of their courses. Toma, my understanding is that you do a fair bit in that space.
Hi. Yes, I've more or less given up on broad teaching and 100 students and so on. I feel privileged in the sense that that I'm not doing that, and I think that that's maybe that reflects my difficulty in part of the issues that have been raised so far. Right, it is a lot more work intensive to work in clinics, in moot competitions, but it also is a delight to work with 3 students on one very, very focused issue, where you know that they have the background, or that you've provided them with some background, or that they've devoted the time, and then they also, they drill down very, very deeply into one particular issue, as they would probably in practice. It's just highly recommended, but it doesn't solve the problem that I think that we have in higher education. Between the breadth and depth problem also relates to numbers. And we're all measured also by indicators. How many students do you have in a class? Different systems, different budgetary constraints. And that's something that we're sort of getting around here, I think, in this. And I'd be happy to hear if Thomas has any insights on that, right? I mean, how do we deal with the large N that we want to, in any area of law or education in general? We'd like to reach lots of people, but we can't reach them all at the same level of depth and quality. Experiential learning, whether it's through moot courts or clinical work, it's sort of, I feel that these are the best courses that you can actually devote your time to, but you're reaching out to a very, very small number of students ultimately.
It's an age-old problem, isn't it, Toma, of reaching out to everyone and having the same experience for all students. But I think, if you're going deep into a subject, that takes time and effort. So you're kind of compromising then the breadth a little bit, aren't you? So it's quite hard to get the mix right. I think of, bringing in all of the content and understanding that you want the students to be, going through, but at the same time, having them go deep into a subject. And I think, Emily, back to your point before, where they are, really interpreting the material that they're using, you're teaching the skills rather than the content. And so that drilling down into the content or teaching the students how to go deep into a subject and then come back out and then apply that or interpret that to the world around them is the important thing. But.
And it's also amazing how much things have changed in such a short period of time for so many of us. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that we were working face-to-face in classrooms with students, and now I think probably most of us are teaching online, if not exclusively then in part. And so COVID has really incredibly quickly changed a lot about how we teach, and also the potential of who we can teach and who we can reach in our classrooms. Thomas, what do you think are some of the most important things for people to understand if they're teaching online for perhaps the first time? Like, what are some of the critical decisions that you need to make. A lot of people listening in now will be about to step into that online classroom.
How much time do we have?
Just a minute, just summarise.
Just a minute. Okay.
You know, 20 plus years of experience in 3 minutes.
Right.
Got it.
The most important thing here is that teaching online is teaching. You know, it's not a set and forget thing. I think last year, or up until last year, a lot of academics, you know, would have their PDFs or their content online, and they'd be doing a lot of face-to-face. But in this world we're living in, and it seems very uncertain going into the future as well. So, you know, we don't know if this is going to go for another year or more. So it's really teaching. It's not set and forget. You have to be engaged in that particular space, in that online space. And I know it's really difficult, but so I think what you need to do then is start to think about designing your course for teaching, you know, with the students interacting with their peers, they're interacting with you, and they're engaging with the content. And then the second with the content then is that you make that content engaging for them. Another kind of little tip, I guess, is one thing that I found really important is kind of overlapping activities in the online space. So for example, if you have you know, a forum or some kind of social engagement, and then you have a lecture or some kind of tutorial, that you're flowing the learning through the course. It's not individual activities that are isolated from each other, so that you're creating a kind of narrative through the course, as you may well do in a face-to-face. Just quick go through a list of tips. Develop a community of learners is critically important, particularly when you're online, because everyone's at home. If you can set up a community of learners, it's fantastic. And I just want to say, just recently we've experimented with using a more social media type communication tool outside of a normal learning management system. And that has worked so well with students, where they can talk to each other, they can ask their tutors questions. It's 24/7, and I know that's a horrible thing to say to busy academics, but your engagement in that kind of system is not, I think the old way of doing it was you had certain times that you would teach, you go back to your office, you go back to teaching, you have tutorials. It's not like that online. It's very, you do have those moments where you have that, but it is a ongoing thing, and it doesn't have to be Sunday night at 10 o'clock. You know, you can set up times for that. And the other thing I'd just say is chunk up content with engaging activities around that content, so that, you know, the students can take one thing, have an activity, go to the next thing in a kind of rhythm. And for all academics, listen, in this world that we're living in, suddenly you're thrust into the online learning space. Start small, do something. If it works, refine it, make it better, go to another thing, do it again, and do that, you know, through the semesters, and you'll find that you're actually becoming very effective online.
I think also one of the early tips that I remember learning from Thomas, like many years ago, is that where you put especially things like videos up online, that students just really appreciate that it's, you know, it's authentic and it's genuinely you, and that it doesn't have to have an insanely high production value. You know, it doesn't need like it's come out of a movie studio, that actually is something which is authentic and shows a bit of who you are and is a bit more conversational and a bit glitchy and imperfect is absolutely fine.
Personal, yes.
That was always a bit of a surprise to me, I have to admit. I thought initially that I'd need to do something super flashy.
Right. Yeah, not necessarily. And again, that comes back to that idea of, you know, engaging online. You have to engage online. And that's the teacher presence. Lisa, you're right at the beginning of the course, putting your face up there, describing things. We're also experimenting at the moment with having small videos or even audio peppered through a course of the academic guiding the students through the content. So you can do that before a course starts. So you can you might have 20 of these through a course. again, that's that teacher popping up in moments where the students need to be motivated or they need to just go on to the next task or something, and you're guiding them through the course. So
Right,
it is a different world, but there are ways to make it really, really effective.
Mm. What about the other panelists? I'll throw over to anyone who wants to jump in here. What's been your experience so far of online learning, and do you have any great tips or tricks that you'd like to share?
Yeah, definitely. Can I come in?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, please.
I did an international IP class, in the last semester, because that was offered for master students, and then they picked it up, and then I got to teach this. So we did some fair bit of teaching, some 10-15 classes, and then we went into the lockdown mode. One of the problems that we faced, in terms of the lockdown was the question of standard texts, digital texts, not being available. And that's one of the things, because if you're teaching international IP, except the ICT resource book on trips and development, other texts are still not in digital formats, from what I have understood. And that is one of the kind of problems. But we overcame that by having more general access to open access materials, including the WTO analytical index and stuff like that. So as far as access was concerned, that seemed to be the major issue, apart from minor breakdowns in the internet. But I was more concerned about how would we carry on this real world interaction in times of COVID, because teaching, I think, a fair bit of teaching can go on in the online environment with all the kind of things that we are adapting to. But the real world is the real world. You can't replace it actually with the digital. And I can think, for example, in terms of the students getting exposed to summer schools. We have a Center for WTO Studies at the Indian Institute of Foreign Trade in Delhi, where a fair bit of summer school teaching was actually useful and equipped the students to sort of inspire them to take up masters and other programs that specialize in international trade, or at least they tried and had a general LLM, but then they moved on into specializing trade. I think that kind of the feeling of fraternity that you have when you are together, when you are at a place, I don't think that can be easily replaced in the digital environment. So those kind of things, in terms of networking and in terms of trying to motivate students to sort of get into specific fields through these summer schools or through live internships, I think that cannot be replaced with digital. The clinical, I think, cannot be replaced.
Certainly very
been my
much
experience.
in online environment. Emily?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I had a lot of resonance with what you said earlier, actually, Lisa, and also what Thomas has said. I mean, I think that what most of us have to kind of grapple with is the fact that we're not doing distance learning. This is not about kind of something designed as online, but we're actually looking at how to translate what we do, and most, we do it well, or what works that we do in a face-to-face physical context, how to translate that to online. So yeah, it's not about the kind of production values, but it is about the personal. It's about creating the community of learners. It's how to recreate the interactivity. So for me, having gone through that kind of, oh my God, we're going to have to make this look absolutely fabulous and perfect, back to actually what works, what am I good at in the classroom? What works for me in the classroom? Okay, what works for me in the classroom is interactivity. It's small group discussion to get that interactivity going. So how do I move from an array of icons, because the students don't want to have cameras on, to create a very one-way teaching experience, which online can be? How do I move that to being the kind of interactive discussion that I value and the students learn effectively from the classroom? And there are ways of doing it. So you have to say, well, we can't do small group discussion on plenary, but we can use breakout rooms. So what's the platform that allows me to use breakout rooms that will allow me to do that? So it's about actually taking what we know works in the physical online direct world. So what Thomas said about the kind of almost signposting, moving the students through the module, actually we know that from our experience in lectures, that actually before you start a lecture, the introduction is, well, what have we looked at before? What's the purpose of what I'm going to do today? So then what am I going to do? So it's not actually reinventing the wheel, but it's finding a different way of presenting that in order to make it work in the online. And I'm not suggesting that's easy, and I certainly don't have all the answers, but that's the kind of approach, the way that I'm thinking through it in my preparation
And-
for the new world.
Yeah, and Emily, I would also argue that the value you have for the students in the face-to-face experience is your expertise, right? You are there as an expert, and they, you know, they get that expertise from you and you know, apply that or whatever you're doing in the activities in class. I think it's the same online. So if you're setting the online up for you to, you know, impart your expertise at moments through a course, then that's also a value to the students in the online space.
And to just touch on one of the questions in the Q&A, I think the message that's coming through here is that while there are some specific skills that we do need to pick up, like practical skills in dealing with the technology, the fundamentals of teaching stay the same, even when we translate them into an online environment. And, you know, I'm sure I'm not alone in saying that, you know, regularly in a classroom, you have to coax students into making those initial comments and feeling safe in your face-to-face classroom to say something that's perhaps not correct, or they feel like, you know, they're the only one speaking up. And so that skill translates directly into the Zoom classroom as well. So, yeah. Anyone else wanted to jump in and say anything about tips and tricks there? Toma, did you have anything that you wanted to add?
Well, not about tips and tricks, because I think, you know, a lot of this is pretty well known. Certainly, for example, breakout rooms, things that we wouldn't normally do in face-to-face class. But more generally, I think there might be a shift in the participatory composition in a class, that there are students who cognitively, socially, actually will be more comfortable with the online format, as opposed to those who are gung-ho about, you know, what in the US are called gunners. In law school, for example, where you have lots of people who are silent at the back of the room. So this is a kind of qualitative difference that I'm not sure that is worth researching, worth looking into, certainly in law schools, but everywhere. It's not just more or less, but who is participating, who is learning, and what is the learning process with the shift to this sort of non-personalized. It's also very social. It's already been mentioned. You don't have breaks with people going to the, you know, the water fountain, meeting in the hallways. We all feel that, I think, as faculty, but certainly for the students, it's also it's a tremendous difference. Going to college now, going to law school, it's completely different from what it was. And we as teachers have very little influence about that.
And at the same time, what you lose from water cooler conversation or the coffee line seems to have been replaced with showing one another their pets. So, which I think
if you have one.
really lovely in a lot of ways. It certainly brings everyone into the lives of each other in a way that we never really contemplated. I guess we're sort of getting to the point of wrapping up soon, but do you think that that COVID will change the face of teaching forever? I mean, we have enormous possibilities once we've realised that we can do things online to deliver courses to the world at large, notwithstanding time zone differences and things. But Thomas, what do you think? Will teaching ever go back to how it was?
Yes. Oh, no, it won't. It won't go back. I don't think so, because from what I've seen here in Australia, you know, we're very much, there's been a massive movement into the online in the last 6 months, with a crisis through the first part of this year with assessments, when they suddenly had to move online, and there was a crisis around, you know, how are we going to do that? How are we going to invigilate assessments? And we've gone through that whole process now to start to reimagine assessments that don't need invigilation, and, you know, they're spread out through a course and things like that. And I think it's not only the academics that have embraced this and are looking into it and being supported by some universities, not others, but are being supported by, you know, instructional designers or learning designers so that they're actually looking at it and going, actually, you know, we can get the same learning outcomes from probably a blended approach. Wholly online is a different thing, but as it settles down, hopefully next year, a more blended approach, I think that will be the thing that goes forward into the future. And it's not just the academics, the students are getting used to this as well. So the students are moving online, they're discussing online, they're learning online. And if the online experience is effective, which it is becoming more and more, I think, then, you know, they'll look at that and say, you know, it's a great learning experience. I agree with you, Tomo, the idea of the water cooler thing, going onto campus, socializing, you know, is critically important. But for us at the moment here in Australia, in particularly postgrad courses, we're looking more and more now into shifting it online and moving into the microcred space a little bit more, so that we get a kind of lifelong learning of adult learners, you know, as they go through their life and they can pivot in their careers. So that's
a very fundamentally different approach to how people learn things, right? Like the traditional model of learning in the classroom has been, well, you learn it just in case you need it later. And then the idea of micro-credentialing is you learn it just in time when you realise that you need it. And
yes.
I think that's a very interesting and challenging approach for an area like international economic law. Like, what is just in time learning in terms of the rules of the World Trade Organization? It's a big thing to learn just in time.
Right.
And how do you ensure a continuity of knowledge across a very big and important, you know, and detailed and interactive sort of area of law? So we have a lot of challenges ahead. So I was warned that time would go extremely quickly, and it certainly has. So I'm conscious that we've just got a minute or two to wrap up. So can I just hand over to each of you again in turn, just for your, you know, 1 minute sense or wrap up or anything that you'd like to add. Yogesh?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So I, you know, just following up on the COVID and the change, you know, that we are experiencing, I think there is a radical shift. Definitely, you know, online is going to be the new normal. One of the things that I think it's going to happen is there's going to be a new market for digital learning. Although, you know, some students would still prefer to, you know, sort of go to college. One of the things that digital learning can do is to bring down the cost of education and bring down the cost of high quality education. I think if students do not have to pay for their, apart from their tuition, you know, pay for living in some foreign country, living in, you know, some other country, I think that's going to save a lot of their cost, especially for students from India who have these resource crunch. And I think that's you know, one way of thinking about digital education. The second thing I also think is there is a kind of winners all approach in digital teaching, because if these courses are made available to a large section of students, definitely I think you know, students would definitely want to pick those courses which are being taught by the best teachers in their country or you know, abroad. I think that's also going to happen, provided, you know, there is over a period of time. I think these things are kept you know, open by the universities themselves. So these are the kind of changes I'm expecting, you know, that will take shape, and I think largely the education market is going to drive you know, all these changes in the digital space. Yeah, thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you. Emily?
I'm touring between going to the question that you flagged in advance for us as a possibility of what kind of final words might you have of advice for someone teaching international economic law for the first time. And I think we've covered quite a lot of it in the discussion about breadth and depth. But I think that maybe it also goes a little bit towards answering Gabrielle Gary's question about how do you sell your module. And I think that the answer for me is partly bound up with the necessity to actually clearly identify what it is that you want from the module or the course, and what it is that you want the students to take from the module at the end. And, you know, clearly one of the things that I guess I've emphasized during this is that I have a focus on, you know, what are the underlying skills or what are the transferable skills that students might take from the module. Yes, rigorous engagement with the rules, but then actually how they can transfer that into other contexts or transfer it into dealing with legal problems or other contemporary challenges that we have. So really focus on how this knowledge and development of international economic law can develop those transferable skills. I think you need to be clear about what you want to get from it, what you want the students to take away from the module. Don't try and do too much. You know, this is what moving on to general advice. Don't try and do too much. You can't do everything. That's the breadth depth issue. Don't be too prescriptive. I'd absolutely say don't pin yourself down to covering too much, because you need to leave room for flexibility. It's an iterative process, developing and delivering a module. And so you need a bit of time. Some things will take you longer than you expect. Students will respond less well to some material. They might want to spend more time on other things. So don't be too prescriptive. Give yourself some flexibility. That can be challenging. You have to be willing to kind of fly by the seat of your pants a little bit at times, because you need to adapt in front of the students as they are, but it's your subject, and hopefully you're teaching it because you want to teach it, because you know it, you have that expertise. So actually then enjoy it. Think about what it will give you pleasure and excitement to teach, and go for that as part of the module.
I love that advice. Thank you. Toma?
It's not advice, but to pick up on some things, because I've heard a lot more mention of market. Maybe it's because we're international economic lawyers than about community. And I think it's important to remember that the definition of a university is a community of scholars. And that is what I'm looking ahead 50 years, whether there will be a change in the methods, in the modes of delivery. That's one thing. The question is, the challenge, I think, is how to replicate the sense of a community of scholars, people who are learning together, and there are lots of opportunities, I think, with online learning. MOOCs have existed for, I don't know, God knows how long now, 10 years, right? At least the technology has been there. It's the pedagogic technology that I think is still lacking. How to replicate the sense of learning, questioning, certainly in law and international economic law, questioning each other. That's and it relates to the socialization issue that I was referring to before. That's sort of looking ahead. It's not advice, but that's what I think we should be thinking about.
Thank you. I also like the idea that this is a great example of a community of learning, and perhaps that while there's lots of downsides to COVID, this is an amazing upside to actually be sitting in our own homes without all the hassles of travel, and actually discussing something like teaching with a community of people from around the world. Touches also on something that Aditya has said in the comments about what more we can do as a Society of International Economic Law to actually co-develop our teaching practices and look at how we can do things in a more community-oriented way. So that's a great topic for a future conversation, perhaps. And Thomas, last word to you. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a great opportunity for everyone in education now to really reevaluate what we're doing, and use the tools that we have to create really amazing learning experiences for our students.
Thank you. And thank you on behalf of the audience to all of you as panelists for being here with us this morning, this afternoon, or this evening, depending on where you are. And thank you to the audience for your active involvement. It's been wonderful. Just a reminder before I hand back over to Marcus that the next conversation is the 10th of September, African Continental Free Trade Agreement in an era of multilateralism. So please mark that next conversation in your diaries, and thank you everyone for your participation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And let's hope the vaccine gets out soon. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Marcus, did you want to have the final word there?
Well, it's odd if I don't say something now since you called on me, but really nothing. The only thing that remains for me to say is thank you to all of you for having taken the time to do this. Thanks to the audience, and I wish that everyone is well in these certainly uncertain times.
Wonderful. Thank you.
All the best.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Very much.
Bye.